So thank you so much for having me, and it should be a very interesting discussion. You know, I was listening to the Prime Minister this morning, and he was asked about the precarious nature of our labor force, and you know, what he was taking away from that to apply to the future. And you know, he talked in very optimistic terms about how now is an opportunity to build a better and fairer society, particularly when it comes to labor conditions, and how right now we have a great opportunity. So let's fill in the blanks for him here. You know, over the past few weeks, I've been struck by how little we know about huge sections of the workforce. You know, on our front pages, we see personal support workers dying of COVID and catching it. They are more often than not Black, more often than not women. They've been putting their lives at risk, walking across the border, first at Robson Road to get asylum in Canada, and then ending up taking care of our very sick people. We see the Filipino workers in Alberta crowded into meatpacking plants and in poor living conditions, also catching the virus. And we see now temporary foreign workers out in our farmers' fields in the same kind of condition. And you know, we knew some of these weaknesses before, but we were not confronted on a daily basis with how tough some of those conditions are. So I think we have some great speakers before us here that can really look at the weaknesses and strengths of our labor market, and what we can learn from today, and how we can fill in that very optimistic vision that the Prime Minister set forth today with some interesting solutions. So I'll just go through who we have with us here. Rhonda Fernandes is the Executive Director of the Future Skills Office at the Employment and Social Development Canada in Ottawa. Future Skills mobilizes action across sectors and stimulates transformative policy innovation to ensure that Canada's labour market and training system are responsive to job seekers, workers, and employers' changing needs. Rhonda is subbing in for Rachel Warnick, who was called away at the last moment. She previously worked with the Office of Literacy and Essential Skills, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, the Indian Residential Schools Resolution Canada, the National Secretariat on Homelessness, and Canadian Heritage, Aboriginal Peoples and Human Rights Programs. We also have Wendy Cukier. She's a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy at the Ted Rogers School of Management and a founder of Ryerson's Diversity Institute. She leads a number of large partnership-based projects aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. That a Diversity Institute is a partner on Skills Next Reports series with the Public Policy Forum, which will include, among other things, some forthcoming papers looking through the lenses of gender and race at the opportunities and gaps in skills training in Canada. Jennifer Robson is an Associate Professor of Political Management at Carleton University, where she teaches courses in Canadian public policy. Before joining Carleton, Jennifer worked in the voluntary sector and the federal government. She writes on issues of Canadian social policy, including parental leave, financial exclusion, household finances, and social assistance policy. She's been watching the policy interventions rolled out over the past few weeks with an eagle eye for their impacts on workers left out of the equation. And she has a fabulous plain language guide for navigating government supports that many individuals from the public have come to rely on. Tabatha Bull is President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and a proud member of the Nipissing First Nation near North Bay, Ontario. She began her mandate as President and CEO of the Council in March of 2020, so congratulations, working with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses to help strengthen a prosperous economy and Canadian market. She's also a member of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce Board and has been working with members to improve business competitiveness across all sectors in the economy. Before joining the CCAB, Tabatha led the First Nations and Métis relations team at Ontario's electricity systems operator. So welcome to everybody. I'd just like to kick it off with some general statements from all of you about the pandemic. I mean, clearly you've come to this with a great deal of knowledge and analysis about the labor market beforehand. It's often said that the pandemic has highlighted or amplified or exacerbated some of the things that we saw already, and has made them that more compelling to deal with. And so I'm hoping we can just go around and you can tell us generally what we are learning so far, and if the pandemic has changed your thinking at all, or just lit it on fire a little bit more. Rhonda, could we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for that, Heather. So I think, for a number of years now, we've been involved in a lot of discussions across the country in terms of the future of work and changing nature of work. It's a conversation that's been ripe for a while now in terms of how disruptions are affecting in terms of workplaces and people's lives. And I think that generally, since COVID, that conversation definitely has ratcheted up, and people have been talking about just the accelerated nature of that disruption, how it's affecting people. I think one of the things that, we've noted a shift in terms of before we were talking about skill shortages, and this is kind of one of the top of mind conversations across the country. And how do we think about equity and inclusion as we go forward? Obviously now we're in a circumstance where we're observing high numbers of people who are unemployed, and trying to think through how we're going to support people in terms of their re-entry into the labor market. And so for some people that might be particularly challenging as we go forward. So that's going to be interesting to have the discussion with the panel today in terms of how we think about that as we go forward. I think one thing that's kind of stood out for a number of us is the importance of caregiving. We've all observed sort of what effect that has had on people's ability to participate in the labor market, and how that might pose some challenges in the near term as well as we go forward. So I think that's one of the key issues I think that's come to the front for a lot of people in these conversations. And then I think the last thing that I would close on is just, it's something that we've talked about for a long time now in terms of social determinants of health and how that contributes to people's life outcomes. And so this is definitely something I think that's very much at the forefront of people's thinking now in terms of where we're seeing who is particularly adversely affected, and how we might think about how we will do things differently as we go forward. So I'll just stop there to let others weigh in.
Okay, Jennifer, would you like to go next about just to give us an overview?
Sure. So how has this changed my thinking? I actually have a hard time thinking and talking about the impacts of this pandemic without talking about gender, because I think that has been just a huge factor here, and for two reasons. First of all, I think we are coming to realize how important gender segregation is in different sectors, right? The goods producing sector, hasn't taken quite the same hit, but the service sector really just got clobbered, and it's going to take clearly a longer time for it to rebound. And that's where an awful lot of women who are in the paid workforce are employed. And at the same time, I'm looking at what provinces are doing, and sort of scratching my head around, how they're making decisions with regards to what gets reopened fastest. And I think some big questions ahead around what sectors are going to be attracting government support and stimulus. And then the other aspect of gender has to be talking about, just as Rhonda mentioned, caregiving and the disproportionate burden of unpaid care that falls on women. So pre-COVID, women with kids lose an average of about 2 weeks a year of paid work, versus about just 8 days a year for men with kids in the labor market. But by the time we sort of start the clock from when schools and daycares closed in March to when schools might, we hope, reopen in September, we're talking potentially 6 months, right? That's a huge disruption in terms of opportunity for work. Two other things I'll say really quickly. Maybe the focus on gig work, where we have defined the problem of gig work being, some instability in terms of your income, not a huge amount of control, right? Like a real vulnerability or precarity of that kind of work. And this has me thinking that maybe our definition of what we mean by gig work needs to be altered, that actually maybe that precarity in employment is not just about people who are working for the platforms and Uber, but is actually a little bit more widespread in the labor market. And then last but not least, I can't help but notice that a lot of the same markers for vulnerability to job loss during COVID were also markers pre-COVID for for economic vulnerability, measured both in terms of income poverty and also asset poverty. So women, newcomers, workers with lower formal education, younger workers, and likely racialized communities as well. We've seen them all have worse outcomes in terms of employment during COVID. And those are also the groups that were more at risk of poverty before COVID. So I'll stop there.
Hey, thank you. Wendy, should we go to you next?
Sure. So I don't want to repeat what's been said, other than to say, clearly I agree. I think a few additional comments. Just when we look specifically at structural issues, the wage gap, the underrepresentation of women and diverse groups in leadership roles in science, technology, engineering, and math, and so on. Those things have exacerbated the impacts of COVID. And as was mentioned, some of the sectors hardest hit are the ones where women and other groups are overrepresented, and the ones that are doing reasonably well are the ones where women are and others are less represented. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, especially because I think with a lot of organizations, there's a LIFO, last in, first out kind of mentality, and where diversity and inclusion was a nice to have when things were going well, it's fallen off the radar. And I've seen an incredible resurgence of manels, for example, where women are at the forefront of the healthcare, the public health discussion, and so on with respect to COVID. But when it comes to economic recovery and innovation, for instance, they are completely absent. And where that's important is not just in terms of keeping things like childcare and homeschooling at the forefront of the discussion, but a lot of the work that I do is with entrepreneurs, and exactly what we're talking about with respect to the employment of women, racialized people, Indigenous people, and so on, are amplified when we look at self-employment and small businesses owned by those very groups. And you see the same things, overrepresented in the services industry, and yet many of the recovery programs are focused on high growth tech, Steve Jobs and his friends' businesses, rather than taking into account the diversity we see in the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. And that has ripple effects in a number of ways. The burden of childcare is crushing. Women entrepreneurs surveyed in Quebec, 60% of them said that they'd lost 50% of their productivity. And you add to that the challenges that newcomers may face in homeschooling, and the ripple effects of this are dramatic in terms of youth, because if you have parents who can't help you with your homework, who don't have the resources to hire a tutor, the gaps that already existed are going to be amplified. And I have real concerns about almost a lost generation of young people because of all the things that were discussed in terms of disruption. The impact that that's also having on kids is massive, not just on their parents. And the long-term implications of that are also really important to consider, because we know education is the strongest predictor of social mobility, particularly for marginalized populations. And so if we're reinforcing the barriers to completion and success in school during this time, we're increasing the pressures and the stresses at home during this time. As I said, I think the multiplier effects are massive. But I do think everything that was a problem before is worse now. At the same time, I just wanted to make one other point. I've been working in the tech sector for 40 years, and for 40 years, we've been talking about the potential of technology to transform education and health and government services. And universities, for example, which have been particularly resistant to new forms of online learning, and, I teach the way I was taught 40 years ago, transformed in a weekend. And so when we think about, you know, some of the positive impacts of COVID, there are opportunities that we could take advantage of. When we look at people with disabilities, for example, we know that university graduates with severe disabilities have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts who don't have disabilities. And when you talk about accommodation, what are some of the top things that people with disabilities need in order to participate effectively in the workplace? Flexible work hours, the ability to work at home, etc. And we have transformed the workplace and many of our services in a way that actually creates massive opportunities for people living in remote communities if they have internet access, people with disabilities if they have internet access, and so on. So, of course, we have to look at the terrible impacts of COVID, but I think we also have to open our minds to the opportunities it's creating to do things differently.
Okay, thanks. And Tabatha, we'll go to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. So I won't repeat a lot of what was said, but I think in every crisis, we definitely, every crisis seems to highlight the gap between those who have and those who do not. And, you know, early on, from a social perspective, there's a real concern when you're telling people to move home, stay home, and wash your hands frequently. And a number of Indigenous communities are overhoused. And you know, don't have clean running water in order to do that. So immediately we saw, you know, how there's a difference between how this crisis and pandemic has hit communities and Indigenous businesses. For Indigenous businesses, you know, as Wendy said, it's great that we are able to now flexibly work from home, but broadband is definitely still an issue for a number of rural and remote communities where Indigenous businesses normally are. So we've really seen that as a bit of a struggle. We've definitely seen some Indigenous businesses that are in the tech sector and we're able to move quickly to adapt, but there are a number of small businesses, a high percentage that are on reserve particularly, that just can't work from home remotely the same way that others can from an infrastructure point of view. And we understand that that's in the federal budget and has been for the last 2 years. And we've been pushing to ensure that they're continuing to focus on that, particularly as well as we move to online learning for those students that live on reserve and are being educated on reserve. I think the other thing that's been really evident is the need for a voice of diverse people and underrepresented people in government and in the social services sectors that are developing the programs. Understanding that the government has rolled out programs faster than they ever have before, which I think is also a positive from COVID, to understand that they can move quickly in responding to needs. But a number of the programs originally as rolled out, there were gaps in eligibility that were specific to small, medium enterprises, as an example, who can't hit the payroll requirements for eligibility, but also for Indigenous businesses on reserve, that they were ineligible to apply for a number of the programs initially. And the government has been responsive when we've raised those concerns, but we need to be thinking about those when the programs are built, not as a fix later that causes a delay. So I know we'll talk about programs a little bit more, so I won't go into more detail on that, but I think that's what we're seeing initially.
Okay, thanks. So we all want to talk about solutions. I can feel it coming out already. So let's just go straight there. I guess a question, first of all, for both Rhonda and Jennifer. You know, you both expressed how caregiving is so essential for women who have, you know, disproportionately lost their jobs and now are having a heck of a time figuring out what to do with the kids so they can go back to work. I wonder, is it too late? Are we already delayed on this, and is it because, you know, we see provinces opening up at different speeds, but they're opening up quickly. There's a lot of pressure, obviously, for companies not to go bankrupt and so forth, but they are opening up before the childcare arrangements have been made. What do we do about that? And is there any way that it can be done in an equitable way now that the opening up has already sped up so quickly? Rhonda, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the question of, is it too late or timing? You know, we have to move, right? It is an issue that has to be addressed. It is a challenge for a lot of people. There's the issues of people being able to go back to work. There's also people working reduced hours. And so we're not sure how long that's going to last for people. And so there's a number of issues that need to be attended to on that front. And I do think that that is going to be, for a lot of people, a continued challenge in terms of their ability to participate. And so as we're thinking about things like how do we support people to return to work where there is an employment opportunity that they're returning to, as well as for people who are going to have to reskill or upskill for new opportunities, how are we going to support them to be able to take advantage of those opportunities? And so I think all those issues are very real in terms of how we support people to be able to get back to work. But I think you're right that and Wendy can speak to this too in terms of how caregiving is going to be key to that.
I want to follow up with Wendy, but if we can just hear from Jennifer first.
Sure thing. So is it too late? So the eternal optimist in me says, no, there's still things that we could do, but I do really worry about this because, a couple of months ago when provinces started putting out their reopening plans, I started to notice, childcare was either not even mentioned in the plan or was in a very late phase. And, even now when provinces, for example, here in Ontario, even when provinces have said, absolutely, you can open, giving 3 days notice, no new support, is not actually an opening plan. And even in provinces where they've done a bit of a better job on that, I think it's really important to remember none of those childcare operators are able to serve all of the families that they currently, or that they served before COVID, right? None of them are operating at 100% capacity because for the foreseeable future, all of the childcare providers are going to have to adapt to some kind of social distancing protocols and things, right? So as long as that's the reality, I think that there's maybe something we can do. In other words, give childcare providers opportunities to set up satellite locations so that they can at least get to something closer to their pre-COVID levels, which we already knew were too low, but at least that would be something. So that's one idea that I'll put on the table.
So Wendy, is there not an onus here also on the employers and the companies themselves to figure out childcare solutions as they're bringing people back to work? I can't see that it would make any sense to, if you have a workforce that is even close to 50%, or if you talk about mothers of young children, there's going to be a significant proportion in any major company that are the people dealing with this. Is there not something that isn't it incumbent even on employers to figure this out as well as policy? Oh, you're on mute.
I think the issue of where the boundaries are between private sector responsibility and public sector responsibility are subjects of debate, whether it comes to skills development, upskilling, reskilling, childcare, and language training even. My personal view is that some employers have come up with very innovative solutions, including wraparound services long before COVID, because they recognized that their employees were the most valuable resource that they had. And so if they provided on-site childcare, if they were employing newcomers, having on-site language training, having flexible hours, and so on and so forth, were actually really good for business. And I think that those principles will continue to apply in some areas. I think we have to work especially hard with some of the small medium enterprises, which are bearing the brunt of the dislocation and historically did not have a particularly good track record on some of the diversity and inclusion initiatives, and try to figure out how we're going to both support them, because they're really struggling in post-COVID, and also, move them along the diversity and inclusion curve. And I think one of the things we need to keep doing is thinking at an ecosystem level, and how large companies, which have the resources and the heft, can actually help smaller companies in their value chain. I think, using procurement as a tool to move smaller businesses along the trajectory, massively important. I think that there are also a range of very innovative public-private partnerships that we could really be thinking about. And in addition to childcare, I just wanted to make a pitch for one of my favorite projects is an initiative offering free tutoring right now to Black families in Toronto through the Lifelong Leadership Institute. But tutoring is one of the great social equalizers, and there are all sorts of interesting ways we can use social platforms, combinations of volunteers and paid help to level the playing field. And I think this is an opportunity to really think out of the box and come up with more innovative solutions that don't fall back into the blame game where, you know, universities say it's not their job to help people find jobs, and employers say they're looking for people who are ready to hit the ground running, and government says you work it out and figure out ways we can work together, because there's a huge opportunity for Canada to develop systems as opposed to the sort of discrete bits and pieces we have right now that we talk about when we look at training and employment, and bring the pieces together in a way that works in a much better way than it did pre-COVID to kind of accelerate both social and economic development.
Thanks. So Tabatha, I'm going to ask a variety of that same question for you. In terms of, you mentioned that we've been talking about broadband and equitable access to technology in remote communities for many years, and now we see that it's more urgent than ever. We see a fast reopening of the economy, and yet we still don't have that infrastructure in place. Is it too late, or how can we recapture? How can we take advantage of this opportunity?
You know, what we've been able to do is just continue to push, and I think the pandemic has added an additional requirement for government to really consider that they need to ensure that they're able to provide the same equitable service to Indigenous communities as non, and I think the education lever is one that's really going to make them make that more of a priority than perhaps the business was. Even, and it's not even just remote communities. So my community is Nipissing First Nation. It's about 15 minutes drive from North Bay. And I was on a call with the minister and a number of business leaders, a Zoom call like this, and I had to turn my video off. And that's not remote. It's just, and even we have some businesses that are at Six Nations that are e-commerce business, and they have times as well as when they cannot serve their customers because of the infrastructure. So I think this has provided us a platform to be able to highlight those specific issues and be able to ensure that we're putting a push on that. And we have received good feedback from government on a focus and a refocus on ensuring that they can move through on their broadband plan.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the policy instruments that have been introduced already. There has been quite a bit of help put out there in terms of emergency benefits for wage support and for income support and loans and rent. Is any of that stick around? And what do we take from some of those programs that are out there? Is there something that we've learned from those that we should be able to take to make for a more permanently equitable workforce? Who would like to start with that one? Okay, Jennifer.
Sure, I'll jump in. And I'm going to focus specifically on CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which we know has now been temporarily extended. I want to be really clear, I am not advocating for a permanent CERB. I am not advocating for a basic income. But I think that we learned a really hard lesson. Like many people, including Sunil, that I know will be talking later in today's program, many people have been saying this for a long time. EI is broken. When you've got a system that cannot meet, that cannot literally handle the demand that it faced during COVID, and even if it could keep up with those applications, it doesn't cover nearly enough people. Pre-COVID, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of unemployed people actually were able to get money out of EI. that is not a system that is nearly inclusive enough or responsive enough. So there are aspects of CERB in terms of being much more flexible, much more inclusive, using the trust but verify principle. And I think those are worth thinking about going forward.
Okay. Wendy or Tabatha, do you have are you looking at any of those programs and thinking, okay, that's particularly valuable at this point?
Tabatha, did you want to start?
I think we're more just looking at, so as I mentioned before, originally a number of the programs, a number of our members were not able to apply to. So the wage subsidy as an example, we were about 3 weeks delayed for a number of Aboriginal Economic Development corporations to be able to apply to that program. So I think the key thing about the program is the ability to be flexible and the ability to be able to adapt programs once a program is rolled out. So as Jennifer said, EI, there were significant issues with EI. And then CERB was launched, and then we were able to roll them together. There's still a lot of concerns about clarity on a number of the programs and the fear of applying in the wrong way. So if I applied a wage subsidy under one type of regulation and looking at the comparison to revenues, because there's some options there, how does that work moving forward? And what if I apply one way and then I need to change it? So there's still a lot of businesses out there, I think, who haven't applied because there's a fear about reprisal and there's a lack of clarity. So I think from thinking about what we need to continue, I think it's more on the framework and the thought about flexibility and adaptability to be able to change programs as businesses start to use them and as we understand what works and what doesn't work. I think also we need to be considering, and I know, we've had some input into the wage subsidy extension, but we really need to look at a tapering off of programs versus a cliff. How are businesses that as they're starting to reopen and their revenues are starting to increase, but maybe they don't have a drop of 30% revenue, a 15% revenue, it's pretty difficult for them to then go to a 10% wage subsidy. So we need to be looking at some type of weaning off of the programs, I think, rather than, if the eligibility doesn't work anymore, then the program is no longer available to you.
So, and Wendy, what do you think of, there's been some provincial and federal movement here to raise minimum wages for personal support workers, for example. That's a temporary thing. We saw some companies doing it voluntarily too, and now rolling it back. Is there, what message do you take from that in terms of, supporting essential workers going forward, or whatever? Do you see that? Is there anything there that we take away and that becomes more permanent?
Possibly. I mean, I think one of the things we haven't really talked about is how we've really shifted our thinking about essential workers and what essential workers are. And, we always used to think of frontline workers as emergency support, firefighters, police, and the other ones who drive the ambulances. And I think that, and there was a general understanding that people in those occupations deserved attention, respect, and good wages because of the risks associated with their jobs. I don't think anyone signing up as a PSW thought that they were going to be putting their life on the line. And I think that it really requires some rethinking about how we classify, especially very gendered occupations going forward, and understanding more about how essential those are, because that does drive wages. But I did want to just make one other point, apart from the digitization piece, which I think is something I hope we're going to be able to hang on to where it's appropriate, is, and this comes back a little bit to Tabatha's point, the process has also really laid bare some of the structural challenges that exist in getting money to people who need it and deserve it. And a lot of the programs that are being rolled out, for example, through financial institutions, and except for the chunk of money that went to CCAB because it was recognized that financial institutions had their own pathologies that prevented some people from getting access to funds. And in my mind, one of the most important things that could come out of this is the idea that we really have to hang on to a gender and diversity analysis when we're thinking not just of policy development, but policy implementation as well. And it's so critically important when we look right now. I mean, we had a call earlier this week. There are a lot of Indigenous, racialized, and other women generally, who are running businesses or self-employed, who still are having trouble accessing the kind of resources that they need. And we know in emerging economies, it's well understood that microfinancing, microgrants, investing in women is one of the key pathways to economic and social development. And somehow we haven't embraced that in Canada. And I do think there are some real opportunities to rethink our models, especially around self-employment and small businesses that have been sort of flagged during this process and need to be further unpacked.
Thanks. We're going to go to questions soon, but I saved Rhonda for last in this round because she's got her hands on the policy levers. So now she can grant all your wishes, right, Rhonda?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think, it's really interesting from just listening to Jennifer and Wendy and Tabatha speak. Any one of these issues has such complexity to them. And then when we think about it in terms of gender-based analysis plus to it, and what strikes me from the conversation that we're having is when we think about intersectionality of identities, and I think Tabatha, you spoke about it really eloquently in terms of just people trying to make sense of these things when they start to come together. And so I think that's going to be one of the things that we're really going to have to think through as we go forward is, as we try to work through every piece, we also then have to think about people's lived experiences where they're dealing with multifaceted issues, and how are we going to be able to be responsive to those diverse issues and meet people where they're at. So I think that we're going to see a lot of these questions be really looked at more closely and unpacked as we go forward. But I do think we're going to have to then look at the cross-cutting nature of these things and how we're going to be able to make this be more responsible to people's lived realities in their diversity in communities across the country.
Okay, I want to turn to some questions, and at the end of it all, I think I'm gonna just do one final round from you guys about I want to get one piece of advice for the Prime Minister. But let's go do some questions first, and you can develop your one piece of advice in the meantime. So the first question is, are there any out-of-the-box policy interventions that you think are worth taking seriously, like a 4-day work week or shorter working days or working from home by default or so on? Is there any great ideas coming out of this pandemic that we should run with? I don't know who, does anybody want to step forward to take that?
Tabatha?
No, I mean, I think the work from home for those of us who are able to do it, and particularly, although as a mom, so I have 2 boys, they're a little older though, grade 9 and grade 6. It's definitely demanding when the kids are also at home and you're teaching them at home, but the ability to be able to work from home and have a flexible schedule is so important and so needed, particularly for women and moms. And I do think that the pandemic has woken up those people who were naysayers and thought that you're not productive if you're working at home. And I do hope that type of flexibility and that ability for people to find a flexible schedule, and not just moms. Maybe I'm someone who needs to take care of my ailing grandparent or my ailing parent. And I do hope that from this pandemic, we are learning that people are just as productive in their own home and on their own time and schedule as they may be in an office. And the office environment isn't the most productive for everybody. So I'm hopeful that will continue.
Okay.
Heather, if I could jump in on that one, just to build on top of this point, I think just a slightly different perspective in terms of thinking about persons with disabilities. And so one of the things that I think is interesting in these conversations is how we broaden our understanding of persons with disabilities in terms of some people are living with continuous disabilities, but also the dynamic nature of disabilities in terms of for different people, whether they're progressive or recurrent or fluctuating. And so I think part of our conversation around persons with disabilities is understanding different lived realities for people, and then how can we think about how these flexibilities might be a way to unlock and enable people to be able to participate in the labor market more so and more fulsomely. So I think there's some interesting things there from a policy perspective in terms of inclusive workforces as we go forward.
So there's another question here. Are there any best practices from other countries that are handling inclusion through the pandemic, say better than us, or anything we should be borrowing from in terms of inclusion in the workplace? Wendy, do you see anything, or Jennifer?
I think, I think some countries move more quickly with some of their supports for people and businesses in ways that were more responsive to diverse needs. I actually think Canada, though, is a global leader in many respects on the diversity and inclusion issues, simply because in many countries, they're a bit ahead of us in terms of gender equality, but very few have as much going on as we do on other dimensions of diversity and inclusion. And even though we don't always get it right, I do think, to Rhonda's point, the intersectional lens, if you think about some of our policies and programs, we are really kind of at the forefront of responses that use that as a lens. So, we've just done a review of leading practices at organizations around the world, and I would say there are a few things. The UK, for example, has more transparency around where the money's going from financial institutions. We have some areas of opacity in terms of who's actually getting the money, and are we serving people equally? But I think Canada is doing reasonably well on the aspects of diversity and inclusion that we normally think about in terms of the workplace.
What do you think, Jennifer?
I think it's kind of mixed. So I would note Canada's the only country, for example, that in its pandemic response included measures specifically targeting gender-based violence. So that's, kudos to us. I think that some of the distinctions-based measures for Indigenous communities probably also mattered and made a difference. And on the other hand, I know that there's been a fair amount of interest in the reopening plans in places like Hawaii and New Zealand that actually much more clearly did the work of GBA plus analysis in terms of coming up with their recommendations. So I'll be interested more to see what happens with that, because I'm always interested in impacts as opposed to just policy on paper. And I would say that one thing that Canada did really well was pivot fast, right? We came into this pandemic without kind of a social policy architecture that a lot of European countries had, that they could essentially just put more money into. We actually had to innovate on the fly. And so I think actually we deserve some credit and some kudos for that.
Thanks. So then there's a question here that is quite personal in terms of advice, and maybe I could turn to Rhonda and Tabatha for this. What advice do you have for people, individual workers and their families, and the people that you're dealing with in your everyday lives and in your work? What advice do you have for them trying to navigate through this massive economic crisis, surrounded by a plethora of support programs, but also by very, very uncertain job prospects?
I'd love to hear Tabatha's answer. In community, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a heavy time right now for definitely Indigenous people in the media and where we are right now. So I think my biggest advice is just to focus on your mental health and focus on those supports. And, as a leader in our organization, that's been my biggest priority of my team, for sure. making sure that we're all, initially when we transferred to remote from home, that was difficult. That was some of our team, particularly if you live alone and, you don't have any other interaction externally. So how are we as businesses ensuring that we're focusing on the mental health of our team? As individuals, how are we focusing on the mental health of our family and our children? And definitely the reaching out and going through the plethora of programs can be overwhelming. But there are a lot of supports out there that both the government has put in and associations like ours have put in, federal government, the chambers of commerce are putting out for businesses to try to help navigate. So there is a lot of help out there, and there's a lot of us out there willing to help navigate through those different types of programs and resources. So I would suggest they reach out to one of those support programs and to look for the help that they need and the services that they can use. And again, to say that governments are responding. The program developers and social finance activators as well are out there responding to the needs of business and wanting to support. So you just need a little bit of help to find the right tool for you. And there's lots of us out here willing to do that.
That's an amazing answer. Rhonda, it's very precise and very practical. Rhonda, do you have anything to add?
I would just basically echo Tabatha's point. I think really people turn to trusted sources for information, and it's often people within their own sphere of influence in their own network. So I think part of the work that we need to do is think about how do we actually get the information into the hands of people that people turn to. So the government puts out information so that people can be able to navigate that, and we do try to figure out how to make it accessible to people in a way that works for them. But then also working with organizations such as the ones that Tabatha works with in terms of Indigenous organizations, with business organizations, with frontline service providers in communities. It's really making sure that the people that they turn to are able to help them to be able to navigate through the information as well and make sense of it. And so I think that's been a key part of all of this and it builds a bit on, I think, Wendy's point earlier in terms of just how people have got together and mobilized to make sure that people have the information to be able to make decisions in real time. And so it's a collective effort of how we can all pool together to be able to make sure that people can get the help when they need it.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left here, and as threatened, I would like to have your, if you could change one thing, or if you could take one thing that we've learned from the pandemic and make it happen. What would your one hope be, or your one wish be, and how would you fill in the blanks that when the Prime Minister opened the door there to, this is an opportunity to improve, make the workplace better and more equitable, and we can fulfill that dream, what would it be? So let's, I guess, can we start with who would like to start?
I'll start.
Great.
I think my key thing, and because we haven't touched on it either, is about procurement and buying from diverse suppliers. And, we're moving into a time of recovery and needing to ensure that both the federal government, all levels of government, but also corporations are going to need to be purchasing PPE, face shields. They're going to be needing to look at ways that they can reopen safely. And, initially when the government of Canada really needed 10 million masks a week in large numbers, it makes sense to go and to invest in businesses that can be able to produce that. But now that we're moving into state of recovery, we need to be looking at investing in diverse suppliers. So women-owned businesses, Indigenous suppliers, Black-owned businesses, either to help them pivot so that they can provide the needs of the country, or suppliers that are already able and ready to supply that. I think that's a real key component and a real opportunity for us to ensure that we're able to keep those businesses open. And, women-owned businesses employ more women, and Indigenous-owned businesses employ more Indigenous people. So by supporting those businesses, we're supporting a diverse economy and employment as well.
Okay, thanks. Wendy, do you want to go next?
Sure. So for me, I think there are two things. One is stealing from Vicki Saunders, the idea of radical generosity and how we can leverage sharing platforms to match people with needs. people who have stuff they need, whether those are resources, whether that's advice. And Tabatha's nodding because she's been, I think, part of those discussions. I think, you know, others have said it's our Dunkirk moment. And in addition to thinking about what we need, I think we have to think as individuals about what we can offer and who we can work with and help and so on. And the other piece is, in the same spirit, we have an amazing opportunity to solve, in my view, the youth underemployment problem by harnessing the energy, enthusiasm, and skills that many youth have to help rebuild and to build capacity. And whether it's you know, some of the current work integrated learning programs, for example, were designed to help big organizations populate their co-op programs. I think there's a much broader range of opportunities to create work integrated learning programs for students, recent graduates, newcomers to go into businesses, help them transform themselves, digitize, do things, get work experience, and make a contribution. And I think, again, if we think out of the box and start to erode some of those silos and take a kind of systems-wide strategy, we will find that we have a lot of the resources we need for recovery and to drive innovation. We just have to organize them in a different way and build more collaboration and partnerships.
Okay, thanks. Rhonda?
So I know a big part of the work that we're doing is that we really want to try and think about how we drive a future that is equitable for all. So really thinking about things like accessibility, diversity, inclusivity. So, you know, my hope is that that's where we're going to take policy into the future, that we can design and think about things that is to the benefit of all. And then I think the extension of that is that, you know, we hear a lot lately the new normal, the term the new normal. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that the new normal is a choice, and it's a choice that we're making today. It's a choice that we're going to continue to make. And so when you tie these two things together, I'm hopeful that, you know, we're going to choose to create policies, programs, and, you know, drive for greater equity as we go forward.
Thanks, I love that point. Jennifer?
So you're only letting me have one thing, and I want more than one thing. I want a package, and I guess I'm just
two
gonna.
things.
I noticed that.
So I think that's going to be my main advice, is that this is going to need a package of measures to respond. It's going to need reinvesting in childcare. It's going to need rethinking how we deliver our income security policy. It's going to mean setting up governments to actually be able to do the analysis, right, that is more inclusive and that does take GBA plus seriously and builds it in at the front end, including on issues of procurement like we've heard. So look, I've got a long list. I'll spare you the whole lecture, but I just wanted to make the point that there is no quick fix, right? We need, this is going to be a long road ahead, and we're going to need to actually address it from a number of different angles.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is Rhonda Fernandes, the Executive Director of the Future Skills Office. Wendy Cukier, who is a Professor of Entrepreneurship and Strategy at the Ted Rogers School of Management and the Diversity Institute. Jennifer Robson, an Associate Professor at Carleton University here in Ottawa, and Tabatha, the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Thank you to all of you.